Appreciate once again the opportunity to bring a lesson. I've decided to call this lesson the God of the Exodus. The lesson is drawn primarily from Exodus chapters 2 through 7. And in just a few moments, I want to read a passage from Exodus 2. Before I do that, I want to introduce the passage that I'm going to read as the basis for our lesson. Going back in your mind and your recollection of Bible history, hopefully you remember that the brothers of Joseph hated him so intensely that they had thoughts of killing him and wound up selling him as a slave to a caravan of Ishmaelites. He wound up in Egypt. Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, bought him. He worked for Potiphar. He was his slave. Then he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, wound up in prison, and through a series of dreams, interpreting the dreams of the baker, the butler, and then eventually Pharaoh. He went from prison to being the governor of Egypt. Very remarkable, but not an accident. It was all the plan of God. And 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty. The 7 years of plenty allowed them to store up a lot of grain to be ready for the famine. And Joseph was given the responsibility to manage all of that. So he was really in the favor of Pharaoh. He was well liked, respected, looked up to, and managed things very, very well. It's all recorded in the latter part of Genesis. But then Exodus opens up and tells us a king arose in Egypt that did not know Joseph. And so the tide turned. And so this king did not know Joseph, and then along with that, the population of the Hebrews just exploded. And then they were seen as a threat. Pharaoh said, if we get into war, then they just might join up with the enemy and fight against us, so we got to suppress this problem. So they made slaves out of them and literally just tried to wear them out so they wouldn't have time to do anything but just work. Made slaves out of them. They made bricks. They still continued to increase, and they said, well, we got to do something else. And they tried killing the infant boys. You remember all this, how that they even had the midwives with orders. If it's a boy that's born, kill him. But the midwives respected God, and they did not do that. And God dealt well with these midwives. And then, since that didn't work, Pharaoh says, if a boy is found, an infant boy is found, throw him in the Nile River. And so times are really rough. In this period of time, Moses was born. They hid him 3 months, and then they couldn't hide him anymore. They put him in a basket floating on the Nile, and Pharaoh's daughter found him. And such a beautiful story where she arranged for Moses' mother to actually nurse him and then bring him back once she weaned him. And so he was brought up by Pharaoh's daughter after some training by his mother, which I think stuck. It made a difference in Moses. But when he was 40 years old, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he wouldn't stand for that. He struck the Egyptian. Egyptian dies. He hides him in the sand, and that's all detected. Now, Moses is a wanted man, and he flees to Midian. And about 40 more years pass. And this brings us, Moses is getting close to 80. He's either 80 years old or close to it. This brings us to the reading of Exodus chapter 2, beginning in verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. I'm struck by how that ends. I'm going to talk about that just a little bit. But in this passage, it says that God heard, and God remembered, and God knew. They cried out for relief, and God heard. Second thing this passage says is God remembered. He remembered that he had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that he would give them the sprawling land of Canaan all the way up to the Euphrates River, and give them an innumerable nation, a great family. It's like if you could count the stars, that's what it's going to be like. Or can't count the sand on the seashore, that's what it's going to be like. So God remembered that, and it says God knew. And I found this very intriguing. What did God know? It just says God knew. God knew. Well, I suggest God knew what he needed to know. God knew everything that was needed. God knew all of it. The Bible says that God proclaims the end from the beginning. God foresees, God knows, and so God knew what their suffering was like. God knew that the promise that he had made to Abraham back in Genesis 15 had now come to a point he needed to make good on it. He said to Abraham, your descendants will be enslaved for 400 years. They'll be afflicted by another nation. Then I will judge that nation and bring them out. So this is going to take up 400 years, God said to Abraham. And so God knew that the time was right. This reminds me, you remember the statement of Paul, I think it's Galatians 4 and verse 4, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his son. So God knew when the time was right. God knew it's time now for me to act. So this is all very interesting. And I find in this passage some things about God, and I want to just talk a little bit, first of all, about what we see here in this picture of God. There's a picture of God here. And then I want us to talk about God and Moses. Some things that happen in this interchange between God and Moses in these chapters. Then I want to talk a little bit about God and Pharaoh, God and Egypt. So what about God? What do we find here about God? Well, it's interesting that when God told Moses his plans, and he said, now you're going to go back and you're going to go to Pharaoh and you're going to go to the people of Israel and you're going to get them all together and you're going to work with me and we're going to do this together. Then Moses said, what'll I tell them when they ask, who sent you? What is the name of the person who sent you? And I don't know why he asked that. He knew who God was. He had his reasons. It makes me wonder if back in the Israelite families, maybe they were talking about trying to understand God better. I really don't know why he asked that. But it is so fascinating what God said to him. What God said to him, if you look at Exodus chapter 3, and verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. So then God just said, he starts out this way. There's more that he says, but he starts out this way. I am who I am. And tell them, I am has sent me to you. Now, This has been interpreted so many different ways, and some Bible scholars have even gone so far as to say that God was being intentionally mysterious here. I don't know about that, but I honestly, I prefer personally to think that there's so much about the infinite God that it'd be impossible for him to fully explain it to us so we'd understand it all. And so I think God is simply being honest with Moses here, and he's saying, I am who I am, and you go tell them I am has sent you. Well, it goes on and says more. Verse 15, God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. So he is the great I am. He is. What does he mean? What do you think he means? And I really don't know. I think there's an indication. Maybe he's saying, I am the self-existent one. I wasn't formed or created. I am. I'm self-existent. And of course he is, in the beginning God. Perhaps he is saying that he is active and present, and he is the reality that is always present. So in all of time, he is, and he is present in the events that reveal his person. And we certainly find in Exodus a lot of grounds for that. There are a lot of powerful events in Exodus that are done by God. And they reveal him. They reveal his person. They reveal his character and his power. And so he is the God who causes things to happen. He is the God who is. And furthermore, tell them, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He also says to Moses, I have come down. Look at this in just looking a little bit further here. In Exodus 3, back up in verse 8, he said, I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians. Don't you find it interesting that God says he's come down? And he did come down in a unique way, because in chapter 3, there's this burning bush, and Moses sees this bush of flame, but it's not burning, it's not being consumed. And so he turns aside to see what's going on here. And then a voice comes out of the bush. It's God. God speaks to him and says, Moses, put off your shoes from your feet, your sandals. The place where you're standing is holy ground. And he says, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he talks to him from this burning bush. So God came down. What does that remind you of? Surely it reminds all of us when God came down in Jesus. He did literally come down, became a man, walked among men. But here also God came down, and this person in the bush, it says it was an angel of the Lord, and you compare this with many other passages in the Old Testament that talk about the angel of the Lord and the character of this angel, about how this angel had the name of God in him, and this angel is actually called God. It seems to be the case that it was Jesus himself in his pre-incarnate state. We know for a fact, whether it started right here or not, we know for a fact that Jesus was very involved in the lives of the wilderness Israelites, because Paul makes a statement in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1 through 4. He says, our fathers were baptized in the cloud and in the sea. They all passed through the cloud and the sea. They were baptized under Moses in the cloud and the sea. They all drank the same they ate the same spiritual food. They drank the same spiritual drink. For that spiritual drink that followed them was Christ, that rock. That rock was Christ. So we know for a fact that Christ was involved, he was active, and I really think he was right here. I think it was the case of God personally coming down. We know the three people in the Godhead. And God said, I've come down. I've come down to deliver them. So I've seen it, I remember, and I know, and I've come down. Now looking here at God's dealings with Moses, in chapter 3 and verse 10, Exodus 3 and verse 10, here's what he says to Moses. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses, he's thinking, no, I don't want to get into that. I'm wanted up there. Of course, God says later on, well, people that wanted you are dead. Don't worry about that. But Moses, he just says, I just don't think I can do this. You know, I'm not cut out for this. He really talks up a real good picture how he's just completely unfit. You know, it's just not for me. And it's interesting how that God answers every single objection. I'm not going to go through all those objections, but God answers every objection Moses has, and then Moses finally says, well, I just can't do it. I'm not eloquent. You know, I've never been able, from my earliest of days, I've just never been a good talker. I've not been eloquent. So I can't go and stand before them. I can't gather these people together and make a speech to them and rally them and then go to Pharaoh. I can't do that. It's really a case of Moses claiming impotence in the face of the omnipotent God. You think about that. Here he's claiming, I'm just so weak and powerless to do this, but he's talking with the infinite, the omnipotent God, the all-powerful God. This is the way God deals with that. I'm looking here at Exodus chapter 3, and I'm sorry, Exodus chapter 4 and verse 10. Moses said to the Lord, "Oh, my Lord, I'm not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue." Then the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth." Now God had already told him, I'll be with you. And that should have, that from a reasonable standpoint, that should have done it for Moses. He should have been convinced right then when God said, I'll be with you. Because I think he surely knew how God had been with Abraham, been with Isaac, so much of that detailed in the Old Testament, how he'd been with Jacob. When Jacob came out of Paddan Aram and came back into the land of Canaan, after he'd been there a number of years and had a family and all these children, the Bible even says, it's recorded in Genesis 35, the Bible even says that evidently he's coming into hostile territory, warlike nations around him, but God protected Jacob so that none of those warring nations reached out to touch him. And then when later on, when Joseph ran into his hardships, it says again and again and again, the Lord was with him. And so now God promises Moses, I will be with you. You're not going down there alone, I'll be with you. But he stands his ground, he says, I can't. So it's a picture where God finally says, now you go. I think he did it in a way where he engaged his willingness, but he did compel him. I don't think he absolutely forced him, but he says, Moses, I'm not going to accept your reasons. I expect you to go. You're the one I chose. You are the one that needs to go. And you know, we hear all this, we think about people. You remember Isaiah? God said to Isaiah, I need somebody to go, but who will go? And Isaiah said, I'm here, send me. What a difference. That Moses wasn't like that. Maybe he was a little bit more like Jonah. You know, Jonah, he just couldn't stand the thoughts of going to Nineveh. So this is God and Moses. Moses so reluctant, just balking. And then the other thing I want to say about God's dealing with Moses, I find so interesting. I want to read it here in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 12. God said to Moses, Exodus 3 and verse 12, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. And I just wonder if Moses was thinking, well, how does that help me now? You're telling me this is the sign that when you get all this done and you bring all these people out of Egypt and you're serving me on this mountain, that's the sign? So you got to go from here, which they were at Horeb. They were there. This burning bush was right there at Horeb, which later on we know was Mount Sinai. He's got to go now up to Egypt. He's got to do all this. He's got to deal with Pharaoh. He's got to convince Pharaoh to let them go, and that's a big job. That's a huge undertaking. Then he's got to bring them out. There's about 3 million of them. Then he's got to cross the Red Sea and come back here. And when you get all that done, and you're on this mountain, you're serving God, then you'll remember, I told you, this is a sign. Isn't it interesting how God dealt with Moses that way and gave him a far-reaching sign, a sign that had no immediate fulfillment? Why? Well, surely it must have been to draw out his faith. He's giving Moses all kinds of reasons to believe. You know, he's already told him, we didn't talk about this, but he's already told him, throw that staff down. Throw it down, it becomes a snake. So he's put Moses through a lot of, maybe you call it therapy, I don't know, a lot of training. He's gotten him ready. He's convinced him. And isn't it just a whole lot like us, you know, like John says in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 3, he says, we really don't know what we're going to be when it's all over. We don't know. He says, we know this, that when he comes, we'll be like him. And so God, he does the same thing with all of his people. He does the same thing with us. There's no way we can see everything, can we? We haven't seen the promised land. We don't know what heaven's like. We don't know what it's going to be like Jesus Christ. We don't know what it's going to be like to have a glorified body. We see through a glass darkly, although I think Paul there is probably talking about something else. Still, it seems to kind of fit. We see through a glass darkly. But God has given us so much to believe. He's given us so much, so many evidences, so many reasons to believe that draw out our faith. That's what he did with Moses. And now just a few thoughts here about God and his dealing with the Egyptians. So God says, this is over in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 21. God is talking to Moses. And he's just previewing with Moses. He said, now, Moses, I'm just going to tell you how this is going to go. It's like God is saying that. He says, chapter 4, verse 21, the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I put in your power, but I will harden his heart. So just get ready. Just understand when you go back, he's not going to fall over and just bow down to you. God says, I will harden his heart. Do you have a problem with that? Do you understand that? And that's the way it happened, isn't it? You know, time and time again, all these plagues, which were literally national disasters, God caused on the Egyptians, Pharaoh says, I'm going to let you go. I'll let you go. But then he would harden his heart again and again. Pharaoh hardened his heart. Well, God knew beforehand. And God said, I will harden his heart. And even in all of that activity, God says, I will harden his heart again. Why is it the Scripture says God hardened his heart? And this morning, I talked about how that God is righteous in all of his ways. God is just. God is fair. God never deals unfairly. The best illustration I heard was so long ago, and you've probably heard it so many times, I'll give it to you again. I'm sure you're familiar with it. You set butter out in the hot sun. Any of these days we're having now would work great. You set butter out in the hot sun, and if the hot sun lasts long enough and we don't have rain, it'll harden the ground and melt the butter. And so Pharaoh, he just had a heart full of self-will and pride. And when the plan of God hit his heart, he just hardened it. Pharaoh hardened it. And so it was really, in a sense, it was God. God was involved, just like the sun out there would be involved in that analogy that I gave you. So God says, I will harden his heart. But he says, tell him this. And I'm going to read from Exodus 4, beginning verse 22. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. And I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. So you know, you're familiar with all these plagues. I know you are, all these 10 plagues. And we come down to the very last plague, it was the death of the firstborn. But God knew how it was all going to play out. God knew from the start that when it comes right down to the end, the firstborn son is going to be on the line. God knew that all the firstborn could survive. They could survive. Pharaohs could survive if Pharaoh would humble himself and yield to God. But God knew that not all the firstborn would be killed. God saw to it, he knew that he was going to see to it that his firstborn would come out of Egypt. It's interesting that God calls them the firstborn. You know, he calls you and me the firstborn. We're the church of the firstborn. And I think here it's used figuratively. I honestly haven't studied it a lot, but some of these things are figurative expressions to express the special privilege that all of God's people have to him. He just says, Israel is my firstborn. And then the other thing I wanted to include here is God's overall plan. What is God driving at? What's God's purpose? What's his objective? Well, in chapter 7 and verse 4, Pharaoh will not listen to you, then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my host, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. And then in verse 5, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. When I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring all the people of Israel from among them. Israel. God said, not Israel. God said, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. I think that's it. I think this is pure and simple. We really don't need to go anywhere else. That says it all. That's what God is doing. Pharaoh is going to know that God is the Lord. The Egyptians will know. In fact, in chapter 8, after the third national disaster by gnats of all things, God caused a national disaster by gnats. When it was all said and done, Pharaoh's magicians went to him and said, this is the finger of God. Finger of God. I don't know if there's some meaning there or not. They didn't say the hand of God. Are they intentionally saying this is just a small representation of what God and all of his power can do? This is the finger of God. So they were getting the picture. They understood it was God. That was God's purpose. And when the Israelites finally came out of Egypt, the surrounding nations, not only Egypt, the surrounding nations knew all about it. They knew about Israel coming out, about how it all happened. They knew about the mighty acts of God and the mighty hand of God. This is the God of the Exodus. There's much more in the rest of the book of Exodus. This is just a small portion of it. But just think about how that God was showing his majesty, his unparalleled majesty. And we're told in Philippians 2 that every knee should bow, confess that Christ is Lord. God's glory is going to be known universally. I appreciate your good attention. I appreciate the opportunity to talk. Maybe it's a good thing voice is kind of starting to get broken here. If we can help you in any way, if you have spiritual needs and we can be of any help to you as we stand and sing this song, we invite you to come.